All right, some quick intro on some background material for week one. Again, this is an optional video for the NCTA 2020 summer program, Beyond Stereotypes. So what this video is going to cover real quick, some introduction to Musui's story, a very, very brief overview of samurai in Japan in the 1800s, and a quick preview of the supplemental readings. All right, so let's start with Musui's story. So this first section that you're going to be reading, it's young Musui. He's a younger child, young teenager, very similar to some other stories you may have read, say Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield. It reminds me a lot of that, only this, is real. But he's obviously a very kind of entitled and somewhat spoiled young man. You're going to see him, run away from home and just throw all sorts of kind of temper tantrums. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see the child of a samurai, who's eventually going to be a samurai himself, describing what his young childhood was like. The book as a whole, you could argue whether or not he really matures throughout the whole story. He definitely gets older, but as far as like emotional maturity, that's debatable. So this whole book here, this is a memoir written by a samurai during the 1800s. So memoirs, take them for what they are. There are definitely times where this comes out very, very self-serving, but we can definitely get a lot of glimpses here of what life was like, and we can really cut through a lot of stereotypes of people have these ideas in their heads of what samurai were like. Hollywood definitely does its part to reinforce those stereotypes. So I think when you read this book, you're going to come across a lot of very different images than what you would expect. All right, so very quick, very brief overview of samurai in the 1800s. 1800 samurai are very different than their counterparts in the 1700s. By the 1800s, Japan has had peace pretty much for a long time. I mean, we get some infighting and a lot of political intrigue and things like that kind of happening. But for the most part, it's pretty peaceful. So you've got about 5% of your population are samurai, are soldiers. They're not supposed to be merchants. They're not supposed to be craftsmen. For those of you not familiar with the samurai, think like, say, Sparta. Your job is to be a soldier. In the 1700s, when there's war going on, there's civil wars happening, there's invasions of Korea, there's all these different things going on. Having these soldiers, they're being used. When you got to deal with the Mongolians invading Japan, these soldiers are very, very important. But during peacetime, to have this standing army that's not allowed to have jobs, things like that, that starts to create problems. Well, by the 1800s, a lot of samurai are getting more and more into low-level political positions. So we see things a little differently at this time. So the samurai era, usually about the 16 to 1800s, we're going to see it end in roughly 1868, the type of era that we're seeing when we have the Meiji Restoration. That's kind of bringing the emperor back into power. During the 1800s, it's not the only time, but during this time, the emperor is just a figurehead. It's the shogun who's actually in charge, has all the power. A little graphic there on the side there, kind of showing you the different people, kind of where they ranked. You'll see that the merchants are at the very bottom. This goes to a philosophical idea that if your only goal is to earn money, you're kind of a dishonest, kind of a horrible person, getting some bad karma, all these different things going on. So you're practically an untouchable, despite the fact that those people had the most money a lot of times in Japan. A lot of those merchants and the craftspeople that have money, during the 1700s, they start taking on samurai to kind of legitimize their position, to get them into doors that they couldn't get into on their own. They start going to a lot of the arts, the theaters, things like that. So the samurai have these patrons who help them through all that stuff. A little bit less as we get into the 1800s because samurai are getting jobs. They're not making much money. They're really not. But uh, the idea is that they're making enough that they can actually live on the money they make now. But the jobs available, they're not equal to the number of samurai that are out there. So as you read the book, you're going to see later on that the samurai line up whenever there's hiring time, and there will be just dozens, if not hundreds, of samurai applying for any position that's out there. All right, let's see. There are still strict laws going on for the samurai. Uh, the samurai are allowed to kill people at this time, the peasants, but not really sure how often they exercise that right. They still are supposed to carry their swords with them at all times. By the 1800s, that's kind of a throwback law, but they're still supposed to have their swords with them. No one else is really allowed to have a sword if they're below the samurai class, the warrior class. Uh, so the samurai that you're probably thinking of, if you have a stereotypical view of samurai, that's likely the earlier periods, the 1700s. But still a whole 100 years here of samurai that very, very different than the stereotypes. We're going to look at two. You're going to have two choices here for your supplemental readings. One of them is Miss Gozen here. She is from uh, Japan, very strong, very prolific warrior woman. Her last battle that's recorded in the Japanese histories, there's a big battle going on. She takes off on her horse, rides into the thick of the enemy, grabs a famous warrior from the enemies, pins him to her horse, and then cuts his head off, and then rides back to her master, all pretty much untouched. So this just kind of very strong warrior woman, definitely uh, not the samurai that a lot of people think of. They think of men. She's definitely not a man, and not subservient any more than your kind of stereotypical samurai, kind of subservient to their lord. So very interesting person to read about. The other person who was supposed to have a movie come out, I think, this summer, played by the same actor who played Black Panther, but with everything that happened, movies I believe are getting delayed, is Yasuke. So the U is silent in his name, Yasuke. He is someone who comes over from Africa and ends up becoming a samurai in Japan. So there's some debate about whether he was brought over as a slave or as um, a bodyguard, but the top dog in the church comes over. He's more or less been given all of Asia by the Pope to try and convert people and run things. He brings over Yasuke as protection, and he's supposed to be well over 6 feet tall, very dark skinned. Exactly where he came from is a little bit up for debate. There is some evidence that he may have been taken as a child and then eventually sold to someone else, and got into the hands of this religious leader. Whether he was a slave or not, like I said, that's we're not 100% sure. But when he gets to Japan, the people in Japan kind of go nuts. They're touching his skin. They line up and cause riots just to see him. One of the nobles in the area is very taken by him, and whether it was an actual request or one of those forced requests, he is given as a gift the services of Yasuke. And so there are tapestries in Japan that depict this guy. There are cartoon movies today about him. And like I said, there should be a movie coming out. There was a book that came out recently called African Samurai. I have read this book. It's, pretty good sized book, but it reads more like a novel than a biography. Most of the facts that are in there are about the religious leader, not about Yasuke. And there's a lot of information in there that there's no way that the authors could possibly have known. So the novelist that the researcher brings in, I think, takes a little bit too much creative license, but that's my opinion. It's a fun read if you look at it more from I think, from a novel like point of view. All right, so these are your two optional readings. You can pick one, you can read them both, but there you go. There's your introduction. I look forward to reading your posts.